I hope I can, if you know something of Locke, I hope I can slightly adjust in some ways your perceptions of Locke, and otherwise simply give you my view of what's going on, especially in that very interesting chapter on powers in Book 2 of the essay. Well, in the essay, Locke declares that the human being is inconsiderable, mean, and impotent, in all probability, one of the lowest of all intellectual beings. And throughout the essay, Locke reminds the reader that the meanings of words, and so all our knowledge, depend on the senses, that our senses are specific to our species, that our species is low on the scale of intellectual beings, that we're limited to the perception of middle-sized objects. We can't see the subvisible corpuscles upon which everything depends. And even if we could see them, we couldn't understand how those configurations of corpuscles give rise to qualities, colors, sounds, solubility, sweetness, and all other properties of material things. Also, he says, qualities depend on the environment, and also we're limited to a very small area of the universe. We cannot so much as guess what's going on out in other celestial regions. Mind-body interaction is inconceivable, and on the side of knowledge of nature, he's concerned to show that our epistemological mediocrity arises from three causes in the nature of things: the dependence of effects on what we can't see, the absence of inferable connections between the invisible and the visible, and the incredible complexity of interactions in the universe. This takedown is not so much, I think, a recapitulation of the theological view that our epistemic capacities were destroyed in Adam's fall, though it trades on it. Really, it's an attack on the Cartesian ambition of explaining absolutely everything, employing both empirical and transcendental concepts. And the critical enterprise Locke is engaged in is not purely destructive. The key notion is mediocrity as well, not depravity or hopeless corruption. Locke wants us to see things differently and perhaps to act differently. But how? There are many answers to this question. In this talk, I have two aims. My first is to show how, as part of this naturalization effort, Locke employs feeble, fallible man, that theme, to reduce moral demandingness. He has little sympathy for the Stoic claim that the philosopher is able to unlearn or staunch emotional responses to events in life, nor for the claim that ideals of virtue as such can be a motive to moral conduct. He aims for a descriptively adequate, realistic account of human cravings, ambivalence, weakness, and motivation, one which does not portray reason as sovereign over feeling. Second, I want to show how Locke's practical philosophy, his views on moral motivation, responsibility, and personhood, is aimed at motivating compliance with certain, as he thinks of it, God-given norms in the face of the materialistic hypothesis that there is only matter and no incorporeal soul, and his awareness of cultural variability in conventions and practices. He does so in a way strikingly different from the way the materialist Hobbes tries to naturalize morality, but in a manner consistent with the same underlying picture. Absent his theology. It's sometimes said that Locke's account of personal identity is forensic, by which is meant it's supposed to provide a legally relevant, useful criterion of responsibility. This is, of course, correct, but the point needs to be generalized. One of the background assumptions Locke was challenging was that an incorporeal, immortal soul endowed with a free will was a necessary condition of morally significant agency. He did not think morality and the law ought to be committed to such an experienced transcendent proposition. Indeed, it should be compatible not just with agnosticism about the soul, but with denial. He will try, he says in his preface, the difficult task to put morality and mechanism together, giving up as far as possible the metaphysics of morals. On his view, he says, all the great ends of morality and religion are well enough secured without philosophical proofs of the soul's immortality, such as Descartes had tried to give. In the final analysis, Locke doesn't paint an entirely convincing picture of how normativity works. For despite, indeed perhaps because of his suspicion that we are hedonistic machines, he needs the Christian revelation with its carrot and stick approach to defining and cultivating virtue. This commitment sits oddly with his metaphysically cautious empiricist outlook. Nevertheless, Locke's project of naturalizing morality as far as possible is impressive, and its more radical elements have perhaps not been fully appreciated. My title, Managing Expectations, refers to the implicit critique in the essay of the power of the human will. For Locke, willing implies desiring and preferring, and emotion-driven behavior is not what takes over when reason loses its grip, but the only real option. Let a man, he says, be never so well persuaded of the advantages of virtue, yet till he hungers and thirsts after righteousness, till he feels an uneasiness in the want of it, his will not be determined to any action in pursuit of this confessed greater good. For Locke, moral motivation can only take the form of appetite. It is on all fours with hunger and thirst. Further, Locke wanted to show that liberty, the condition of being able to do something if you had a mind to do it, is limited by situation, and that self-control is limited by the emotions. We are moved by the prospect of pleasure and pain, the prospect of happiness and suffering. Some wants and preferences of particular human beings, such as food, drink, shelter, and liberty, are universal. Others, such as ambition and lust, take forms that vary from culture to culture. We can be educated by others into new preferences, and there are education and re-education techniques one can try on oneself. But there is no guarantee, in Locke's view, that they will work. They may or may not, and God, as I read Locke, demands perfect obedience, but at the same time forgives many lapses, as I shall argue. To give some context to Locke's treatment of motivation, I want to point to two somewhat opposed tendencies in theorizing about the emotions in the second half of the 17th century, both nicely brought out in Susan James's book on passion and action. First, the passions continue to be seen in Stoic fashion as necessitating the employment of self-control and the invention of strategies for attaining it, including political technologies for dealing with the socially consequential passions of mobs, fanatics, and irresponsible rulers. There were always exceptions to that generalization. Some passions, joy, piety, love of God, were regarded as good to experience and as deserving to be cultivated, along with the passionless state of tranquility. But the Stoic Christian presentation of the emotions as problems remains very strong in this period. As Seneca said, the emotions are diseases and you shouldn't want to be even a little bit sick. At the same time, there is a certain pushback against Stoic ethics in the period, a shift in value that anticipates the very profound shift in 18th century letters towards the positive assessment of emotion or sentiment or sensibility, even with regard to emotions like sadness and pity, of which the Stoics disapproved because they were disturbing to tranquility. Tranquility is rejected as attainable and as an ideal. For Hobbes, tranquility belongs neither to death nor to life, for it is a denial of the vital motions by which we live. In the first place, Hobbes says, I put for a general inclination of all mankind a perpetual and restless desire of power after power that ceaseth only in death. Descartes himself is a leading figure in the habilitation of the emotions. They are essentially good. Like the ideas of the external world generated by the senses, and the ideas of hunger and thirst, the feelings that is, generated by the bodily organs, the emotions are ideas, that is to say feelings, produced by situations. Ideas prompt actions such as drinking when thirsty, according to the designs of God or nature for the preservation of the living creature. While the senses and our internal sensations can deceive us, they mostly do not, and we do well for the most part to trust them. The same holds for the emotions for Descartes. They sometimes need repression, but not because tranquility is a desirable state of the soul, but because they can have bad effects when, through physiological linkages, they produce unfortunate behavior. Locke agrees with this. Our all-wise maker, he says, suitable to our constitution and frame, knowing what it is that determines the will, has put into man the uneasiness of hunger and thirst and other natural desires to move and determine their wills for the preservation of themselves and the continuation of their species. In his chapter on powers, he evokes vividly the misery of needing and wanting things and the individuality and specificity of our desires. So he refers to hunger, thirst, heat, cold, weariness with labor, and sleepiness in their constant returns, and to which, he says, we can add the fantastical, the imagination-based uneasinesses, such as the itch after honor, power, or riches, and the acquired habits that we come to want because of fashion, example, and education, and 1,000 other irregular desires. So he says that we find a very little part of our life is vacant from these uneasinesses. Called onto the stage in the Powers chapter are the drunkard whose habitual thirst drives him to the tavern, despite his ability to see that his health decays, his estate wastes, discredit and diseases pursue him. There's the bridegroom driven to conjugal life by burning, and the Rachel who cries out, "Give me children, give me the thing desired, or I die." For Locke, life itself and all its enjoyments is a burden cannot be borne under the lasting and unremoved pressure of such an uneasiness. On the other side, the innocent pleasures and satisfactions of consuming cheese, lobsters, apples, plums, and nuts are evoked. The desire and need for substances, objects, states, and relationships, whether biologically basic or fantastical and imprinted by culture, is the point of departure for all moral theory, whether permissive or repressive, including Locke's. But Locke does not speak in the Christian Stoic register about the emotions. He is more concerned to understand and explain the drunkard than to condemn him. Locke analyzes liberty, as I mentioned, as a relationship between a person's preferences and environmental constraints. A person has liberty not when his or her metaphysical will is free, but when there are no constraints given by the situation or the laws of nature to what they prefer to do, or, since Locke is not always clear on this point, no such constraints on what a person could do if they wanted to do that thing. But a person also lacks liberty when there are internal constraints that prevent them from doing what it is in their long-term interest to do. That is, what they would prefer to do absent that blocking feature. Lacking liberty is, in fact, a fairly common occurrence. In the morning, the drunkard prefers not to waste his estate. He is free to refuse a drink. But as evening comes, the drinking motivation swamps his preference, and he cannot do otherwise. Locke refers in this connection to those extreme disturbances that can possess our whole mind. Some ideas, he says, like some motions to the body, are such as in certain circumstances it cannot avoid. A man on the rack is not at liberty to lay by the idea of pain and divert himself with other contemplations. And sometimes a boisterous passion hurries our thoughts as a hurricane does our bodies, without leaving us the liberty of thinking on other things which we would rather choose. And a second quotation which says something quite similar. The power we associate with the will thus comes and goes. When experientially we regain control or are able to resist, we feel and describe ourselves as free. But freedom is not a metaphysical attribute that we possess in virtue of having a soul. It is not omnipotent. Having analyzed human freedom in terms of preferences and obstacles, and voiced the view that human beings are neither free nor determined, but sometimes able to direct their thoughts and actions, at other times utterly undone and overwhelmed by them, Locke, in the first edition of the essay, declared that good, therefore the greater good, is that alone which determines the will. It is widely believed that he changed his mind about that in response to criticism. But I maintained that he only changed his wording, which was misleading, not his underlying view, which remains the same in subsequent editions of the essay. The original argument then in the first edition of the essay, which is never really abandoned, runs as follows. Pleasure and pain, whether of mind and body, are produced by the operation of bodies on us. A rather mechanistic idea about how the world works. Happiness is pleasure, misery is pain. Whatever produces or contributes to happiness is what we call good. Whatever produces or is conducive to misery, we call evil. The will is determined by what best pleases it. And then the famous line, good, therefore the greater good, is that alone which determines the will. If we were able to look on happiness, pleasure, and on our misery, pain, with indifference, we would not be free but miserable and enslaved, Locke says. That is, someone who does not respond to hedonic incentives and ahedonic disincentives, in other words, must be in the grip of some pathology and suffer from a disturbed mind and life. Locke is here being faithful to his view that we know only our ideas. Whenever an object or experience or relationship presents itself to our minds as good, as conducive to pleasure, or as mitigating pain, we are motivated to obtain or experience it. But wait, since the good is pleasure, isn't this to say that our liberty is not diminished in having no freedom to be indifferent to pleasure? What? Haven't the reputable moralists, pagan and Christian alike, taught us that it is absolutely essential for morality to be indifferent to pleasure, and that we can turn away from it? How is this view tenable when it seems obvious that people choose different things, including sometimes what is not good, what is evil? Locke's view became rather startling as he developed it to try to answer this question. His first go at it in the first edition of the essay was to say, well, every evil is somebody's good, and vice versa. Some people, he says, are attracted by study and knowledge, others by hawking and hunting, some by luxury and debauchery, others by sobriety and riches. Some people like wine, others want to preserve their eyesight. Locke seems to have realized, however, that such extreme relativism was indefensible. So he introduced a notion of the true good as opposed to the apparent. But the criterion for what motivates us is still hedonic and personalized. The true good is something like what produces the most pleasure and least pain over the long term. And Locke thought if at every instant everyone simply pursued what looked good to him or her and stopped pursuing it if the experience became painful, and if there were no prospect beyond the grave, and if all concerns of man terminated in this life, the diversity of preferences would be beyond criticism. As it happens, what produces the most pleasure and the least pain over the very long term is compliance with God's commands as far as possible for the individual. That was the only way, introducing God's command as the standard of virtue, that he could really introduce an other-directed element into his account of the good. It's evident that he did adhere to New Testament values, deploring certain kinds of cruelty and exploitation, such as those that he laments in his account of the Caribbean savages in Book 1 of the essay. The ones who have children with concubines and eat the children, and then they eat the concubines and do other things that he finds quite horrific and has to put into Latin. In the second edition of the essay, where the chapter on powers was greatly expanded, Locke apologized to his readers for his error in stating that the will always pursues, is always determined by the greater good. Yet the emendation he makes is essentially verbal. Locke no longer speaks of the greater good as attracting and so determining the will, as a Platonist might, who believed that the soul of man yearns for the good, the true, and the beautiful. Rather, he emphasizes the push from uneasiness, the desire to escape from conditions of want and deprivation. Still, motivation remains personal and subjective, and its emotionality is still emphasized. The true good remains what it was, happiness or pleasure, either the greater happiness and pleasure that result in terrestrial life by moderating desires, or the happiness and pleasure that attend obedience to divine commands in the next world, even if the sacrifices and discipline are unrewarded in this world. So for Locke, the solution to the practical problem of escaping pain and obtaining pleasure is to develop a prudential ability to foresee future consequences, and where future consequences in this life are not going to be so bad, to develop uneasiness at the thought that one is going to hell in the next life, and to develop a positive appetite for, to hunger and thirst after righteousness. So the uneasiness view does not replace the greater good view, which was always intended as the greater apparent good. The uneasiness view was always there in the first edition, where Locke had observed that there are in us a great many uneasinesses, always soliciting and ready to determine the will. Accordingly, the chapter on powers turns out to be largely about powerlessness. We can't understand power metaphysically, but there is empirical reality to being in a locked room, or longing for a child we can't seem to conceive, or being overcome by rage and not able to stop. Locke presents the reader with a distinctly mediocre moral agent. Because the mind is not metaphysically distinct from the body, or the will from desire, there are no generalizations to be made about what lies within our power. For different individuals in different cases, what lies within their power is different. Education and reflection are empirically observable inputs to behavior that have empirically observable typical consequences. Their effect is not to orient us to the Platonic good, but to replace some forms of uneasiness with others. We should not appeal to weakness, though, says Locke, as our excuse. Nor let anyone say, he warns, he cannot govern his passions, nor hinder them from breaking out and carrying him into action. For what he can do before a prince or a great man, he can do alone or in the presence of God, if he will. Human emotionality and its sequels nevertheless merit and obtain divine forgiveness in Locke's theology. After all, our frame and constitution and what determines the human will, we're up to the creator of heaven and earth, he says. Here he rejects Puritan morality, exemplified in sermons such as those by Jonathan Edwards, the author of The Future Punishment of the Wicked, Unavoidable and Intolerable, and aligns himself with the Latitude men. So I'll say a bit about that. Has been argued that the introduction of a new sentimentalism in moral theory, the dominant framework of 18th century philosophy, with its constant references to sympathy, benevolence, and pity, was stimulated by the latitudinarian theology of Gilbert Burnet, Richard Baxter, and Isaac Barrow, who emphasized peaceableness, mercy, charity, and love of neighbor as divinely approved virtues. When Barrow, in one of his sermons, refers to that general sympathy which naturally intercedes between all men, since we can neither see nor hear, nor imagine another's grief without being affected ourselves. He comments that antipathies may be natural to wild beasts, but to rational creatures they are wholly unnatural. The divine power and understanding are manifest in the mercy of God rather than God's hatred of sin and the consequences of his wrath. Let us consider, says Barrow, that nothing is more conformable to God's nature or renders us more like to him than beneficence and mercy, and that consequently nothing can be more grateful to him, that nothing is more disagreeable and contrary to the essential disposition of God than illiberality and unmercifulness, and therefore that nothing can be more distasteful to him. And Locke's own theology, in The Reasonableness of Christianity, emphasizes moral fallibility and divine mercy, while still asserting the unique correctness of Christian morality. God, he says, did not expect a perfect obedience void of slips and falls. He knew our make and the weakness of our constitution too well, and was sent with a supply for that defect. As God gives second chances to some persons who appear to have blotted their copybooks in the world, but who could not help it, or were not compos mentis at the time, so he thinks the Redeemer was sent to give all mankind a second chance at eternal life after the first was botched. God, he says, out of the infiniteness of his mercy, has dealt with man as a compassionate and tender father. He gave him reason, and with it a law that could not be otherwise than what reason should dictate. He foresaw the frailty of man and declared that whoever would believe the Savior to be so should be saved. In the essay, then, he comments on the frailty of our minds and the weakness of our constitutions, how liable we are to make mistakes, how apt to go astray, and how easily to be turned out of the paths of virtue. God will require of every man, he says, according to what a man hath, and not according to what he hath not. This excuses the pagans and the savages, and also the person whose rational self-control has forsaken them under pressure. And then the extreme disturbance theme again, the pain of the rack, an impetuous uneasiness of love, anger, or any violent passion. If any of this renders us not masters enough of our own minds to consider thoroughly and examine fairly, God, who knows our frailty, pities our weakness, and requires of us no more than we are able to do, will judge as a kind and merciful Father. So that's one side, I think, of Locke's emphasis on fallibility and mercy. But now I think there's another side to it, which in some ways might seem a bit opposed, and that is Locke's commitment to, rather hedged about commitment to materialism. He's not an atheist, but he is a materialist. Well, a materialist with one exception. God is not matter. For Hobbes, God's matter too, but not for Locke. Well, why would I credit Locke with a commitment to materialism? This is a very vexed question in the Locke literature. Locke is coy. He says, I say not this that I would in any way lessen the belief of the soul's immateriality, but he declares that as far as the modesty of philosophy can pronounce on the question, thinking matter is not beyond the power of God to create. It's apparent that he was favorably disposed towards that hypothesis and unfavorably disposed towards the Cartesian hypothesis of a separable, incorporeal soul. Not just a hypothesis for Descartes, he thought he had proved it. There is strong external and internal evidence for this supposition that I will present to you in a moment, though there are also contrary passages requiring explanation. The view that matter and motion solved all the phenomena, explained everything, and that man was a machine were much excoriated in the second half of the century in English philosophy. But who was actually claiming this? No one exactly, but the purely material nature of the mind was a live topic. Hobbes maintained that all is body, and that even thought is a mechanical calculative process. And Gassendi ridiculed the Cartesian claim for an incorporeal soul in his objections to the Meditations and his lengthy disquisitions. He brought out the old Epicurean arguments for a corporeal mind, familiar in any case to readers of Locke's period from the popular new editions of Lucretius's On the Nature of Things. Most English physiologists associated with the Royal Society, Glanville, Boyle, Willis, Ray, Newton, also Warren Cudworth, insisted that although matter and motion, and later force, explained a lot, they did not save all the phenomena. Certainly not the formation of the world system and the population of the earth with plants and animals, nor for Newton the stability of the solar system, nor for Boyle certain other phenomena, such as the maturation of young people, nor for Moore, Cudworth, and Newton the generation of animals. Boyle and Glanville were persuaded of the reality of demonic as well as divine intervention into nature. Locke did not follow suit. The expected references to what cannot be explained by matter and motion, and without reference to transcendental causes, do not appear in the essay, with one exception to be discussed shortly. Omniscience, power, and providence are ascribed to an original thinking being, God, but no examples whatsoever are given in the essay of what Boyle called, approvingly, intermeddling in the post-creation world. You might object that Locke doesn't discuss the relationship of God to nature and where mechanism leaves off, because his essay is essentially an epistemological work, not an ontological work. But this supports my point. Locke's epistemology is critical in ruling out of order almost all dogmatic pronouncements about what matter can and cannot do. And so any inference is based upon it about what God must do. Maybe materialism and the absent God is a worst-case scenario for Locke, but there is no positive evidence for that claim. Moving on to the critique of the incorporeal soul, Locke says, the simple ideas we receive from sensation and reflection are the boundaries of our thoughts, beyond which the mind, whatever efforts it would make, is not able to advance one jot, nor can it make any discoveries when it would pry into the nature and hidden causes of those ideas. We have an idea of the soul derived through experience as an immaterial thing that thinks and can excite motion in the body by willing or thought, and an idea of body derived through experience as involving the cohesion of solid, separable parts. But both ideas are obscure. The idea of matter is obscure because cohesion is inexplicable, and so is the communication of motion, and the idea of the soul is obscure because we can have no experience of things that do not impact on our senses. So as far as proper epistemology goes, that is, contemplation of our own ideas without revelation, as he puts it, we cannot discover either that omnipotency has given to matter, fitly disposed, a power to perceive and think, or that God has joined and fixed to matter so disposed a thinking immaterial substance. This is an echo of the speech Galileo put into the mouth of Simplicius in his dialogue concerning the two chief world systems of 1632. Simplicius observes that insofar as God might have produced the celestial phenomena by any number of underlying systems, it would be excessive boldness for anyone to limit and restrict the divine power and wisdom to some particular fancy of his own. So you can't rule out heliocentrism. Thinking matter is at least as viable a hypothesis, Locke thinks, as the Cartesian fancy of a detachable incorporeal soul. Now, I'll consider first the objection that Locke nevertheless personally prefers the Cartesian hypothesis, unprovable though it may be to this one, and second, the objection that he has no preference either way and is genuinely indifferent between the incorporeal soul and thinking matter. So Locke says it's impossible to conceive that ever bare incogitative matter should produce a thinking intelligent being, as that nothing should of itself produce matter. And he says that the soul is a real being, and that I know that there is some spiritual being within me that sees and hears. This, he goes on, I must be convinced, cannot be the action of bare insensible matter, nor ever could be without an immaterial thinking being. And he says, I agree, the more probable opinion is that consciousness is a next to and the affection of one individual immaterial substance. All this sounds very bad for my claim that he is a materialist. And in his discussion of identity, he seems to take seriously the idea that souls can be detached from bodies in which they are or were resident and attached to other bodies. But to the first point, all Locke means, I think, is that neither matter nor thought could have come into the world in the absence of an original thinking being with creative powers, that is to say, God. You need one. Second, the real being of the soul does not imply the reality of individual incorporeal cogitative substance, by contrast with the real existence of soul functions. All we know is that we have something in us that thinks. A spiritual being, not what its metaphysical nature is, we don't know that, and we can safely take the reference to the immaterial thinking being that is a condition of anything seeing and hearing to be the creator. Third, when Locke refers to the incorporeal soul as the more probable opinion, I take it he is using probable in the casuistic sense. It is the opinion advanced by most authorities. He cannot be using probable in an evidentiary sense, insofar as he maintains that we have no positive evidence whatsoever for the existence of individual incorporeal cogitative substance. And finally, as for the supposition of detachable souls, the aim of all the examples involving the soul of Socrates and the pig, Castor and Pollux exchanging souls, is not to make it appear probable that incorporeal souls can flit about like this, alighting in other bodies, but to show that what we consider relevant to identity is entirely experiential, the existence of first-person memories or the testimony by the person as to what they remember. So if not a preference for the Cartesian soul, unprovable though its existence may be, why not suppose that Locke genuinely has no preference for or against the incorporeal soul? He goes on to say, let men, according to their diverse hypotheses, resolve of that question as they please. Every intelligent being sensible of happiness or misery must simply grant that there is something that is himself that he is concerned for and would have be happy. So against the non-preference hypothesis, I point out that the assertion that thinking matter is possible is made against the background of countless critics outraged by Hobbes, asserting that it is utterly impossible for matter to think. Locke could not have failed to be aware that he was taking an unusual and unpopular stand. If you truly regard theologically scandalous hypothesis A as no more likely than theologically safe hypothesis B, why strive to impress on your readers that the arguments and evidence for B are utterly lacking without correspondingly casting aspersions on A? As well as professions of ignorance as to the nature of substance, material and immaterial, and the observation of the point that the Cartesians simply declare the soul to be a substance and stop at that, there is constant sniping in the essay at the concept of the Cartesian soul, that is the repository of imprinted innate ideas and whose essence it is to think. This essential claim forced on the Cartesians, Locke thinks, the conclusion that the soul always thinks in the womb, when asleep, when detached from the body. But thinking, says Locke, is an operation of the mind, something we suppose it can do, not an essential attribute. Why would God have created an incorporeal soul that produces thoughts of which the subject is unaware, or that it immediately forgets along with its dreams? A thinking mind of whose thoughts we are unaware makes two persons of one man. They who make the soul a thinking thing, at this rate, he says, will not make it a much more noble being than those do whom they condemn for allowing it to be nothing but the subtlest parts of matter. Characters drawn on dust that the first breath of wind effaces, or impressions made on a heap of atoms or animal spirits are altogether as useful and render the subject as noble as the thoughts of a soul that perish in thinking, that once out of sight are gone forever and leave no memory of themselves behind them. Matter, by contrast with the incorporeal soul, he concludes, is not such useless stuff. The criticism of Locke as a hobbist by John Edwards, the careful distinction Edwards made between Boyle, who was very much like Locke in his representation of the corpuscularian hypothesis and his doctrine of qualities, but above theological suspicion, and Locke, who was not considered to be so, and Locke's reception in the 18th century as the principal proponent of thinking matter, all confirm the seriousness of Locke's attraction to that hypothesis. Now my concluding remarks. Locke's epistemology presents the inquirer as competent to advance in knowledge, but limited by his sensory apparatus in relation to the world, as affected by mediocrity. The Cartesian ambition to explain everything and to become masters and possessors of nature is a radically inappropriate goal for natural philosophy in Locke's view. Boyle, Locke, and Sydenham and their successors should, of course, carry on their inquiries, but philosophy should really be trying to get the human mind in sharper focus for the improvement of practical philosophy. That's Locke's view. This means understanding how it generates knowledge by combining ideas drawn from experience and understanding what its limitations are. Mediocrity is, to be sure, a cliché for these people in the 17th century. Human beings are often said to be between angel and beast, sharing in the intellectual powers of angels, but also the bodily functions and passions of beasts. Extra epistemological disadvantages were sometimes held to accrue from Adam's sin, and Locke too supplies theological reference points for mediocrity. As in one of those early quotations, how inconsiderable a rank the spirits that inhabit our bodies hold among those various and possibly innumerable kinds of noble beings, and how far short they come of the endowments and perfections of cherubims and seraphims and infinite sorts of spirits above us, is what by a transient hint in another place I have offered to my readers' consideration, he says. However, this is rhetorical flourish, indeed possibly sarcastic. Our moral mediocrity, in turn, arises from the limits of perception and identification. We are poor at estimating future consequences and at identifying with the people we will become. As well, Locke thinks, not everybody, like the Caribbean savages, as he thinks of them, has had the benefits of a Christian education. How well did Locke succeed in his project of making morality consistent with mechanism? Well, certainly not with atheistic or even deistic mechanism. The implicit distinction between the morally desirable and the merely desired requires a transcendental source of morality in God's commands. Motivation, though, is governed by a combination of appetite and mundane prudence. And in the absence of God's ability to reward and punish obedience and disobedience and his commitment to doing so, Locke would not have much of a theory. He thinks his argument for a creator of matter and thought, that is God, is conclusive and irrefutable. He considers and rejects the objection of Spinozas, who concede the existence of an eternal cogitative being, but consider it to have a material aspect. And he rejects as well the Epicureans, who think particles of matter can produce cogitation all by themselves. But he does not have any sort of argument to show that the eternal cogitative being who creates thought has an interest in human morality. Nothing in our experience or demonstrable a priori indicates that that is the case. And his discussion of revelation and miracles in Book 4 as establishing the unique warrant of Christian morality and its linkage with punishment and reward is fairly unconvincing. So there are tensions in Locke that were absent in, for example, Descartes. Descartes puts God out of the business of enforcing morality, avoiding having to address the question why God creates emotional, fallible beings and sends many of them to hell. But Locke's empiricistic rescue of the emotions is far more dramatic than Descartes', while at the same time he makes God the enforcer of counternatural duties, hence the need for softening for this positive doctrine of mercy, as I argued above. But instead of faulting Locke for having to introduce supernatural elements to explain normativity and to encourage obedience, I wanted in this lecture to emphasize the reverse point, how, while remaining to some extent, though not enough to satisfy his critics, within a traditional Christian framework, Locke makes the passions and the gratification of desires central to life, adopts a moderately relativistic stance with respect to the right and the good, and insists on divine and human mercy as constituents of justice and virtue. Thank you very much.